welcome to the Portland Industrial Land Readiness Project, PILLAR for short. You might hear us call it that. Basically, we have been working on this project for past 18 months, and the project pulled together 4 project partners. If you go to the next slide. Myself, from Bureau of Planning Sustainability. I took over from the wonderful Steve Kuntz, who is on the call right now, since retired. Thanks, Steve. Bureau of Planning Sustainability, Metro, Columbia Corridor Association, and Prosper Portland have come together as project partners. I'll give Kate Merrill a chance to introduce herself. Kate, do you want to go ahead and do that?
Hello, my name's Kate Merrill. I'm the Metals and Machinery Industry Liaison at Prosper Portland on our Business Advancement team, and I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation.
Awesome, thanks, Kate. So yeah, we really just came together to develop and implement a project. As I said, we obtained the grant from Metro. The intention here with the project team is to integrate the city bureaus responsible for land use planning and economic development with the community organization CCA, representing most of the project area. Go to the next slide. The consultant team that was chosen to lead this project was McKinsey, and they brought on Johnson Economics to lead some of the feasibility work that we'll run through. They've done a superb job, and we've also had a wonderful TAC, Technical Advisory Committee, made up of the project partners, other intergovernmental partners, industrial associations and businesses, real estate professionals, and infrastructure and utility staff from the city also, and some private utilities. So we've had about 10 of those TAC meetings, roughly one meeting every couple of months, and have been instrumental in giving us feedback. And yeah, so next slide, I'll talk about the agenda ever so slightly. I'm running through the project overview right now. We'll talk about the project goals and the background a little bit more. And then I'll hand off to Brian with McKinsey and Sid, who will run through some of the technical work we've done, the short-term readiness inventory, the site feasibility analysis, and the strategic land readiness actions. And I'll close with talking about so the summary, the findings, and the next steps. Next slide. So the 3 primary project goals here. The first was to support target industry, business, and job growth. Portland's target clusters include a large share of manufacturing and related supply chain businesses that rely on industrial land. So that's pretty instrumental. The second piece is just increasing our industrial employment land supply. We recently released, the city, that is BPS, released a draft of the economic opportunities analysis, the discussion draft, that identified a really tight supply of industrial land to meet forecasted demand through 2045, the next 20 years. So the intention here is identifying some of the actions to get, I'm trying to understand some of the barriers holding back some of that industrial development, some of our industrial supply, and then also identifying some actions to get more of that constrained industrial land ready for development. The third piece of this project, the project goal, is advancing inclusive prosperity. We're really looking at the industrial development and economic development through the lens of middle wage job growth and sort of equitable growth in our employment sectors. So next slide, please. Where are we talking about? What have we focused on? Portland has about 14,000 acres of industrial land. The buildable land inventory looked at how much of that land is potentially developable. We identified about 2,700 gross tax lot acres. When you factor in constraints and barriers to development, what we're really talking about is about 40% of that, 1,100 acres. So we saw this as a prime opportunity to increase some of the industrial land supply, and the project focus area is really focused on the Columbia Corridor, that area outlined in red there. Go ahead, go next slide. Okay, primary scope, talked about it a little bit more. I'll talk about it in a bit more detail, but there were 3 phases of the work that McKinsey's going to run through with you all. It's a very technical analysis. We're going to break up this presentation and invite questions along the way. We've built in periods for you to jump in, ask questions. Please raise your hand, put questions in the chat. We'll answer them accordingly. But the first piece is going to be talking about the first phase of the work, inventorying suitable industrial sites. We're talking about specifically development-ready sites, stuff that's ready in the near term for development. And that's pretty critical because 33% of our city's projected job growth, can you go back one, please, is expected in our industrial areas. The second, and this is really the second phase of the work, which is really the bulk of where we've spent most of this project, the bulk of the time, is conducting development feasibility and site planning, really digging into the details on 15 sites to better understand what's holding those sites back from development or not, right? Are there infrastructure constraints? Are there brownfield remediation costs? Site prep, how can we better accommodate development on sites that reflect and are spacing on the word, but basically, we took a handful of sites that were reflective of broader industrial trends across our city to better understand what those barriers are. And then the third is really taking those barriers, trying to better address them through strategic actions, whether they're regulatory, infrastructure, brownfield, other development constraints. Next slide, please. Just really fast. I mean, as I said, we've been talking about this for the last 18 months. We're coming to the end here. Mackenzie's due to release a report, the final report that will be available for public consumption in December, and you can see along the way where we've spent most of our time. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when we're talking about industrial development, what we're really talking about these in the context of this project is 5 development types. These tie directly into Advanced Portland's primary industry clusters. So it's heavy industrial and manufacturing, food processing, general manufacturing, industrial services, and warehouse and distribution. Each of these have different site criteria like infrastructure, transportation, and general location needs. So it's really been our aim to test a balanced mix of these to better understand and address the barriers facing their expansion. So on a related note, on the next slide, we have our projects that have fed into this work, fed into this work, and this work is fed into. So the first of which is Prosper Portland's Advanced Portland Initiative. As I just mentioned, I'll pass it off to Kate in a second. I've already mentioned our EOA, which is ongoing. This project's been pretty instrumental in helping inform some of the assumptions we've made throughout the EOA. As well as the actions that have been integrated into our broader strategies. We also have the CCIL project, that's our Environmental Overlay Zone or E-Zone project, that's also ongoing. Mackenzie overlaid some of the E-Zones throughout this work to better understand how those have an impact on development. And then we also have the Brownfield study, which is a separate consultant-run project that gave us a better understanding of how brown these sites are, what are the costs to remediate those, and how those might play an impact on overall feasibility. And then there's a couple of future projects listed there that are, related but not necessarily integrated. So with that, Kate, do you want to talk a little bit about Advanced Portland a little bit?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. As I mentioned, I'm the Metals and Machinery Industry Liaison on Prosper Portland's Business Advancement Team. We're focused on business retention, recruitment, and expansion in our priority traded sector businesses. So that's athletic and outdoor, food and beverage, tech and media, green cities, which includes clean tech, and then, of course, mine, metals and machinery. And so why traded sector? Traded sector is defined as industries in an economy where goods and services are produced and sold outside of the region where they're produced. And they generate income that is spent locally, creating a multiplier effect across the region that benefits local economies, local suppliers, and businesses of all sizes. So this really comes down to job creation. And as we saw on the slide earlier, 33% of projected job growth will be in industrial areas. And that's why this study is really important for identifying places to really host those industries. Our work is framed by the Advanced Portland Plan, which outlines these key industries, and we recently drafted industry-informed plans guiding our work in the coming years. I'm going to put those links in the chat so you can delve further into that. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks, and I'll pass it back to you, Sam.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, so please, I've got one more slide and we can pause for just initial questions before we dig into the technical details. But at a very high level, not to bury the lead here, we wanted to give you, a sense of what we found. There are few surprises. Basically, we have a limited supply of development-ready industrial sites. I don't think that will come as a surprise to anybody, but this project reinforced that finding, that assumption. We tested a lot of sites against infrastructure constraints and capacity and availability, and public improvements are needed, as is brownfield remediation. But with that being said, it was really the high cost when we dug into the feasibility of the development of these industrial sites. It was really the high cost of site prep and building construction that were really having the biggest impact on development feasibility. That's not to say that upgrades to infrastructure, transportation, brownfield remediation costs were not a factor. They were not the top or most impactful factor. So with that said, we have strategic actions that have been crafted. There are many of them that are designed and intended to unlock additional industrial land and address those barriers. So on the next slide, we have a placeholder for questions. So I don't know, please raise your hand or just feel free to jump in if you have questions at this point. Otherwise, I'll hand off. And I should have introduced the rest of the project team by name, but
we can take care of that.
But I can pass off to Brian for that unless there are questions at this point.
All right, I don't see any burning questions, so I will say hello. Hi, I'm Brian Vericchione. I'm the project manager for McKinsey on this team. My background, I worked at a small city in the Portland area, and I've been at McKinsey doing a lot of industrial and public projects for the last 10 plus years, and happy to be part of this project. I was joined by a couple others. Gabriella, maybe you can wave and say hello. She's not part of the presentation, but many of you know her from past industrial lands projects. And she was the principal in charge on this, overseeing and making sure we're headed in the right direction. And then Sid will be our first McKinsey speaker, but before we get to him, Jerry Johnson from Johnson Economics is also here, and he's the wizard that crunched all the financial numbers. So Jerry, why don't you say hello, and then Sid can jump in.
Yeah, hi, Jerry Johnson, Johnson Economics. Know an awful lot of you, so good to see you again. Assuming I'm talking later, right, Brian? So I don't need to talk more.
That's right.
All right.
All right, thanks, Jerry, Brian, Sam. My name is Sid Harharangat. I'm a land use planner here at McKinsey. I'm excited to talk about this project with you today. It's been 18 months in the making and finally excited to share it to this group. As Sam noted, we do have placeholders for questions, but the information's fairly technical. So if there's any questions you have through the presentation, feel free just to kind of raise your hand in the chat. We'll monitor that. So I'm going to start today talking about the short-term readiness inventory. So kicking off this project, Mackenzie looked to develop a short-term inventory of industrial sites in Portland, specifically that study area that Sam shared earlier. Now, one requirement for these industrial sites was that they would be at least 3 acres in size. So it kind of sets a floor of what we're looking at from the industrial supply side. The inventory took into consideration development constraints. So many of those on this call are familiar with kind of the development constraints that are prevalent in the Columbia corridor, whether that be wetlands, floodplains, environmental zones, or any other similar conditions that may complicate development. Once the inventory was prepared, so this is when we had our 48 site short-term inventory, we really dug into each of those sites. The first step was looking at the suitability for target industries. So the target industries, Sam and Kate talked a bit about those earlier, but just to refresh, there's warehouse and distribution, heavy industrial manufacturing, industrial services, food processing, and general manufacturing. And many of these sites are suitable for multiple of these target clusters. So that was definitely noted in our documents. The site suitability study also took into consideration infrastructure constraints. So something that Sam talked about earlier in kind of the high-level project takeaways were infrastructure deficiencies. And we had Mackenzie civil engineers and traffic engineers look at the existing infrastructure network as well as the existing transportation network adjacent and the ones that would serve the sites in the short-term inventory to identify kind of what would be required, where are the deficiencies, and we'll talk a bit more about our engineering analysis in a few minutes. What I want to do now is go into a bit more detail about what is included in our inventory. If we can go to the next slide. So we do have a forthcoming report that'll be released next month for public consumption. And in it, we have a matrix where I think if I share the matrix on the screen here, it'd probably hurt everyone's eyes. So I'm gonna save you from that. But what I do want to touch on are a few of the kind of key components that we have in that document. So initially, we first took a look at the site information. So this is things like zoning, site ownership, addresses, and kind of what overlays and whether these sites are constrained or not. Next, we looked at the land development status. So this is identifying whether a site is vacant, redevelopable, or land banked. And kind of to talk a bit more about that land banked line item there, those are sites where they look to be in service for an adjacent use. So this might be trailer parking for an adjacent warehouse and distribution facility. So it's potentially developable in the future, but it might be likely that the user of the adjacent property may develop it. As I talked about, Mackenzie's civil engineers looked at the infrastructure. So that's the water, stormwater, and sanitary sewer, as well as the transportation network. So what our engineers did in this is they looked at kind of where the existing facilities are and what could be readily served or whether infrastructure improvements would be necessary to serve the site. And what this really gets into is we tiered these sites, but in order to tier them, we had to kind of use a matrix or a scoring rubric to assess the infrastructure of the sites. You can go to the next slide. So again, there's a lot of information on this slide, but the main takeaway I want for this group to have is that each site received a grade based on the infrastructure consideration. So for example, we had the sanitary sewer utility system, and sites received a score of A through C. A would essentially mean that the site can be readily served, there's no known capacity issues. A score of a C might indicate that there's no nearby pipe, there might need to be a public sewer extension to serve the site, or there's known system deficiencies. At the bottom of the list here, we have transportation. So each site was graded for transportation, but the grading was a little more nuanced given the variety of existing conditions and very site-specific and frontage-specific requirements that might be needed. Sam talked a little in the introduction about the interplay between the different ongoing studies, and The city used this methodology here to update constraints in the buildable lands inventory analysis that the city was conducting. So the site grading information was used to assess the tiers of sites. If we can go to the next slide. So tiering of sites. Tiering of sites has a lot to do with developability timeline. So how quickly can a site develop? And what was seen here was that the tier one sites can generally develop within 6 months, and that's to kind of initiate that development process, not to be fully constructed. Tier 2 is within 7 to 30 months, and Tier 3 is kind of on the longer range of short term at over 30 months. So here we can see the interplay between how the engineers scored the utility considerations for each of the sites. So for Tier 1 sites, there would be a score of A, both for transportation, and an A or B for the other infrastructures, where as you kind of go down in tiers, you start to notice that there are system deficiencies or significant improvements that might be required to serve any use on the site. So what did this yield? What was the takeaway from this? The main takeaway here is that there is a limited acreage of those Tier 1 available sites for development. So in our study, we found 320 acres, over 28 sites were available for that Tier 1 level of development. And that constraints had a significant impact on the amount of acreage available for development. So initially there's about 1,200 gross acres, and that reduced to 725 or so net acres when taking out those constraints. And the engineering analysis really brought to light that many of the Tier 2 and Tier 3 sites would require infrastructure improvements kind of to move up in that Tier 1 range. And if we can go to the next slide, here's a kind of a high-level map showing where these sites are located and the tiers associated with each one of these sites. Now, one thing you might notice is there's a lot of boxes on this map, and we follow the city's definition of site, which may include parcels that are adjacent to each other under same ownership. So if you look kind of at the southeastern corner of the map here, you'll see a few clusters of parcels there. Yeah, thanks, Brian. And what that indicates is those are actually two sites. Although they might look like multiple parcels, the city would consider that to be a site for purposes of their buildable lands inventory and in the development phase. We can go next slide. I think we have a pause for any questions.
Sid, there are a couple questions in the chat. Maybe you can grab the first one and I'll do the second one.
Sure, let me open that up. Did transportation look at access to rail as a metric? Okay, that's a question from Debbie in the chat of, did transportation look at access to rail as a metric? So we did consider rail access to be a metric for that transportation scoring or transportation grading criteria. It wasn't necessarily a determinant factor of whether a site would be scored from A, B, or C, but the proximity to rail and service from rail was noted, and that'll be included as part of our engineering analysis in the final report.
So you were more focused at like if you had driveways or access to I-5 or something like that?
Yeah, it was both access kind of both in a local sense. So could they access a public street, or kind of would they have to negotiate with an adjacent property owner for an access easement? So that was kind of one scale. And then taking that out a step farther was looking at a more regional sense of how far is the site from the major transportation network of Columbia Boulevard, I-5, 205. And other things we looked at were whether frontage improvements would be required and whether there'd be additional right-of-way that might need to be dedicated to the city if the site would develop. So there's kind of a whole host of items looked at in the transportation item.
Thanks.
Welcome.
All right, next question was, why wasn't electric and gas service considered in the infrastructure grading? There were a couple of reasons. It had to do with availability of information and the number of sites that we studied. So we looked at, approximately 50 sites, and electric information and gas service information is not publicly available, so we have to interface with the utility providers for that. And the direction from the project partners was, let's not bug the electric and gas companies for this first package of approximately 50 sites, but we'll do it for the next 15, which you're going to hear about shortly. So really, it was just making sure that our energies could be focused and that we weren't wasting other people's time. When it was a fairly big ask to have the natural gas company and the two different electric providers, dig through their own mapping and service information and give us that.
And I see there's a question from Francesca in the chat, and I'll read it out for those who might be on audio only. I imagine those transportation barriers were fully described somewhere in your reports that I can find. Yes, that's correct. We'll have an appendix to our report that'll really have the nitty-gritty information of the specific transportation barriers or infrastructure improvements that might be required for the site to develop.
Any other questions on this segment about the short-term inventory? All right, doesn't look like it. Thank you, Sid. You'll see Sid again in a little bit, but I'm going to talk to you for a while here about the site feasibility analysis, and then Jerry will chime in as part of this. Okay, so what do we do for site feasibility? We looked at 15 sites. And this was in a higher level of detail than the 48 sites that we did for the short-term inventory analysis. Really, the short-term inventory was looking at readiness, and the site feasibility dug in deeper. 15 sites that were selected by the project partners team. Let's study those. Let's look at what the zoning is. Let's see what the development constraints are. Let's identify a target industry, and then Mackenzie's architects and engineers drew up site plans. So we, took the hypothetical, what could we fit on this site? And let's see what it looks like. So for each of these sites, there was a target industry selected. You may remember that there were 5 different target industries, and we met with the project partners and picked one for each of the 15 sites, trying to make them roughly equal. And then we looked at the development constraints. That could be whether it's a small site or if there's wetlands or floodplains or maybe brownfields, and tried to factor that in so we could look at real world situations. The map on your screen shows where the 15 sites are, and similar to what Sid was mentioning earlier, some of these are clusters of parcels, and the reason is they're generally under common ownership, and so that's how the zoning code defines a site, and to be consistent with that, we use the same definition. Now I want to walk you through an example of a site profile. Sam just put a link into the chat, and he also emailed this afternoon a link to the site profile package, where we really detail 15 different sites that were shown on the map before. And I kind of want to walk you through each of the profiles. There's 2 pages. There's a lot of info there. I'm just going to walk you through in general terms, like what are we looking at? So first up, I should mention that when we picked a site, it doesn't mean that the existing use is going away. So maybe you can see in the aerial photo here that there's a bunch of existing development here. This is an auto auction site out by Portland International Airport. We're not saying the use is going away, but why did we pick this site? Well, we thought we could learn from it. The site is near E-zones. It's got floodplain, and it's got some easement through it. Just a lot of considerations that are meant to be representative of other sites in Portland, all of which have their own combination of constraints and challenges. And so We picked 15 that were meant to be representative of those. So the existing use here could continue for many years. But if the current owner ever decided to sell, this is just a hypothetical about what could potentially be constructed on there. So just to shine a light on a couple portions, what we did for each of these was we talked about where's the site, what's the use. This was warehouse and distribution, and I mentioned the site's near the Portland Airport. It's on Cornfoot Road. And then we have some of the nitty-gritty data for information about tax lot numbers and zoning and how big is it. And then we drew some pictures and put in this table, well, how many square feet of building do you get, and how many parking spaces and so forth. So for this one, we drew warehouse and distribution use. The site itself is pretty big. It's about 30 acres, but some of that's got constraints on it. So some of the dashed lines going through here represent floodplain and E-zone, and there's even a couple different scenarios for E-zone because there's the current rules, and then there's some new rules that are under consideration. So we drew each of those on there. And came up with, in this case, about 300,000 square feet of building. It's got loading docks, it's got parking for the users, and so all these things are typical of industrial development. After we drew that picture, we wanted to see, well, what does all this mean? So on the next page, our civil engineers looked at, are there any deficiencies about public infrastructure? So in order to build this as shown, would somebody need to extend a water line or a sewer line, or would they need to do a street improvement? And so we stepped through that for each of the 15 different sites. In this case, we identified that there need to be about 600 feet of a water line extension. Sanitary sewer was fine, storm drainage was fine, but on other sites, it may be the reverse. Maybe you had to do a sanitary sewer extension or something. And then we got information from Pacific Power and from Northwest Natural about, how far away is a decent sized system. Would a gas main need to be extension, or electrical service need to be upgraded, that sort of thing. Again, all of these findings are specific to this site, but they're meant to be representative of conditions you'd find elsewhere in Portland in the industrial market. All right, it's one thing to draw pictures and talk about pipes and roads, but what does it mean for costs? And so that's what's on the left side here. We computed, just using average rates per square foot, how much would it cost to construct the building or to do the site prep? What would it cost to extend public infrastructure? I mentioned a water line extension is needed here. Soft costs, does it have brownfield, and what does all that add up to? So in this case, the site preparation and the building costs, which are the blue and the orange, added up to about 75% of the overall cost. So unlike some where maybe there's a lot of brownfield costs, this one didn't have that as an impediment. We scratch our head a little bit on, okay, we've got costs and we can see the percentage, but what does that mean in terms of development feasibility? And so now I'll kick it to Jerry to talk about that. So we do have conclusions. He analyzed each of the 15 sites, and we put the data for each of them on this site profile, but he's got some bigger picture things to talk about here.
Sure. And so for coming up with the viability basic assessment of whether it still made sense as a development site, we took a look at market assumptions. We logged as many transactions and lease transactions we could find within the relevant market areas, assigned achievable asking and trended rates for each one of the specific sites. to develop assumptions on the revenue side. This was modeled as a speculative industrial development. I know owner occupied are different, but we can't get information on those, and those are, but by and large, the speculative market is what sets the market pricing. So we did it from that perspective. We also took a look at a series of potential market interventions, which included a property tax abatement. Soft costs, architectural engineering is the biggest part of soft costs, but it's also financing costs, permit fees, STCs, lots of other things. So property tax abatements, one of the things we considered. We looked at a 10-year property tax abatement for the improvements. We looked at a potential grant for environmental remediation, and like the case of the one that we just shown, we didn't have an environmental remediation on that particular one because it wasn't a brownfield piece. Well, for brownfield sites, we did look at that. We looked at some infrastructure grants, which would help fund some of the offsite pieces, and we looked at a tax credit as well, kind of see if they would move the needle enough to make some of these projects viable. If we go next one. The basic breakdown we had is of the 15 sites, we found 3 of them worked pretty well, pretty good sites. 6 of them were on the edge of feasibility, which means they didn't pass what we would consider a threshold feasibility test, which meant that they weren't necessarily developable under those assumptions or wouldn't be a viable development, but they were close enough that we thought with some interventions and maybe some trending in the market that maybe they could get there. So they weren't hopeless. Conversely, we found 6 of the sites that no matter what you did to them, it was really hard to make them viable. So some of these we found are fine. Some could be viable with some assistance or trending in the market. And there was a proportion of them that really we just couldn't get a solution to that made any sense. I don't know if that's surprising to anyone or not, but that's the results that we came up with those sites.
And those numbers,
the numbers,
I was just about to say, the numbers that are in there that look very random with the site IDs that are actually they correspond to the industrial sites in the city's buildable land inventory. So yeah, we should have front loaded that.
Yeah, that's a little obscure. Yeah.
Hey, you're keeping us honest. We get too far into the details. We think everyone knows what these numbers mean. Okay, there's a question here about many of the 15 sites are in high liquefaction and lateral spreading hazard zones. Was liquefaction and lateral spreading mitigation cost considered in the cost of site preparation and construction? The short answer is no, that was not an explicit line item. The longer answer is some of our unit costs are probably higher than what a contractor would tell you is necessary to do the project, because we were trying to just build in a little bit of cushion for some of the conditions that could be encountered. So, whether it's adequate or not, it probably is site specific, but that's what we tried to do. All right, so finally, for each of these 15 sites, there was the question of, well, how many jobs might you get and who might they go to? So we looked at equity impacts with the goal of estimating job growth for each of the 15 sites and then adding it up. And there'll be a little table on the next slide, so I won't give you the numbers quite yet, but one thing to explain is that the numbers we came up with were based on information from Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, based on permit data that they were able to analyze. And it was also based on some information from the Oregon Employment Department. And so we were able to apply these sort of generic ratios, if you will, to figure out total jobs and then percentages for people in 3 different groups. The first of which was middle-wage occupations for people that don't have a bachelor's degree. The second was BIPOC workers, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And finally, female workers. And some people fit into more than one slot. So you'll see the percentages don't add up neatly. I should mention that, the calculations we did were purely based on conceptual site plans for each of these 15 sites. So they really represent sort of the capacity of any particular property. Like this site could produce X number of jobs. It doesn't mean that would be the precise number of jobs to expect on that property if it were to develop, because the development might be different than we had drawn it. And also, of course, if there's an existing use on site, if it's not vacant land, there's some existing jobs there that would get subtracted. Presumably the replacement use might have higher job ratios, but that is a little challenging to factor in. So anyway, let's cut to the chase. The BPS data from permit analysis basically indicated that for the 5 target industries, generally it was about 1 job for somewhere between 650 square feet and 725 square feet of building. We applied the ratios, which were slightly different for each of the 5 target industries. And what it said was that if sites developed exactly as we drew, which we know they won't, but if it did, that could be up to 3,800 jobs using these ratios. 53% of those jobs, based on past findings, would go to people with less than a bachelor's degree. 32% would go to BIPOC workers, and 24% would go to female workers. So these job numbers are based on the conceptual layouts we drew. They do factor in the site constraints because we drew buildings around the floodplain, around the wetlands. And so that's why we feel they're a pretty good indicator of the capacity of any of these 15 sites. But again, just an indicator, not an exact number. So that wraps up the site feasibility, and we can ask a couple of questions here. I see there's some chat happening. Jerry, do you mind reading yours out loud and responding out loud too?
Sorry, Steve had sent a thing asking about whether the viability gap distinguished between existing and draft environmental zoning. And unfortunately, the answer is no, because we had one solution. We'd have to take a look at the marginal changes in program and yield associated with the new against the old, which would take more help also from Mackenzie to do such a thing.
Yeah, so Steve, the site layouts we drew were generally based on the existing environmental zone boundaries. Okay. However, we did sketch in the locations of the medium or the mid-range scenario for potential future E-zone, just so we could at least get a graphic indicator of where those might shake out. In some cases, the new E-zones, if they were to be adopted, would constrain more land, and in other instances, they would constrain less land. So it's a site-by-site analysis. I think generally the E-zone's getting larger, but in a few cases, it's not. Oh, and there's a comment here in the chat that the site we showed has reduced E-zone coverage in the latest discussion draft from Cecil. So it's a dynamic environment. The line work we got is maybe 6 to 9 months old. There have been ongoing conversations at the city level, and that's why it's hard for Jerry to figure out viability when the lines keep moving. Okay, got Andrew with his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I was just perusing the 15 sites on the report that you published out to the BPS website. Thank you for doing that. So I guess I had a comment. I'm looking at these 15 sites and they're sort of ranked as viable, potentially viable, not viable. It's a little hard to kind of follow which of the specific sites fit into each one of those buckets. Um, I mean, I'm looking at those individual sites and I'm seeing that viability gap, and I guess I can look at all 15 of them and divine from how large the viability gap number is, whether it's viable or partially viable. I'm just wondering in the final iteration of this report, it might be helpful to just simply list, each of those sites and which of those three buckets they're in. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
and then
Mhm.
because
Yeah,
I'm sort of having to back into it, and it would just be nice to have those sites clearly listed on the summary table. Here are the three viable sites, and here are the actual three.
Yep. So Jerry's got a report that really dives pretty deep into the financial analysis where he does have that. But I do think that's a good point for the final deliverable of these site profiles, that we could summarize some of that early on.
The only other comment I would make is a lot of these sites look very familiar to me. Some of them are completed LIDs, such as at Northeast 112th and Marks and North Subtle Road, and some of them are areas where we've considered LIDs, for example, Cully Boulevard between Lombard and Columbia. Um, and I know we've already had conversations about, the LID component of the infrastructure improvements, but I'll be particularly interested to look at those the summary of specific sites and see how the ones that have been in completed LIDs, how those sort of stack up. And I understand the viability gap may not be related to infrastructure improvements because those have been completed. They may relate to other things in the report. So that'll be interesting information. Thank you.
Can I
Andy,
jump in
it
on that one?
does, well, it does look like they do list those sites in those categories on page 2 of the report. It's at the bottom on the first column, and then with the numbers of the sites, and then the table of contents has what that number is associated with. So I think it's there, but you do have to dig a little bit for it. Sorry, Courtney, go ahead.
No, it's a good suggestion, Andrew. In fact, I'm looking at it and wanting the same thing. Maybe on viability gap, you just do a thumbs up, thumbs down. It would be kind of helpful. But that said, we're not saying this is what's going to happen with the site. This is more of an academic exercise to say, well, gee, what if we put a food processing facility on this site? The owners may say, no, this is just an exercise with a bunch of experts to say, boy, what's the best thing we could do with this site? And the general conclusion that, over a third of them are not viable, regardless of what we do, is useful information for us. In general, not quite as useful for that specific site, I don't think.
And to follow on Corky's point there, it's not even that it's the best thing to put on these sites, right? I mean, we're not necessarily suggesting highest and best use. I said earlier on in my introduction, like we want to test a balanced mix of these prototypes and development types. So it's we try to achieve that. Mackenzie put forth citing criteria, and we overlaid that with these sites to figure out what might work. And we as a TAC, we figured out exactly what that mix was going to be. We moved a couple just to make sure we had enough in each category. So the market's going to do what the market does. As Jerry said earlier as well, these could be built to suit developments down the pipe. It's not going to operate in the same way as a speculative development. So the idea here is just to better understand the barriers, the potential infrastructure deficiencies, the things that could be done to make these better served for new development.
Great. Love the questions. Do we have more?
Did Catherine get her question answered about what are the numbers in the squares?
Yeah, those are the site numbers. Sam
Yeah.
mentioned that. Yep.
And
Okay.
Erica was asking about liquefaction.
Yep, we
Yep.
covered that one.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
All right. Yes, and Andrew's got one point in there. Just because the site may be financially viable doesn't mean the owner will want to develop. So absolutely. Is why we're trying to stress that these are just conceptual and hypothetical. All right, Sid, you can pick up here and
All right.
take the next chunk.
Sure. Thank you. So where does this kind of land in the project? So we took a look at both the short-term inventory and the 15 sites that the site feasibility analysis that Brian just talked about, and kind of saw that what are the common constraints that we're seeing? What are we hearing that are common barriers to development? One of the things that Sam noted at the beginning is one of the project goals is to increase the industrial land supply. So what are some actions that can be taken to kind of unlock part of the existing industrial land supply for development? And so, informed by the findings of both the short-term readiness inventory and the site feasibility analysis, McKinsey and the project partners developed a list of strategic actions that are looking to increase the market feasibility of those constrained sites. So we have a list in our forthcoming report. There's about 30 actions that we suggest, and these are actions for some are future studies, some could be potential action in the near term, but there's kind of a long list of items there. The strategic action categories include regulatory and process improvements, infrastructure utility projects, and brownfield redevelopment tools. And each one of these strategic land readiness actions includes specific parameters. So one is time frame, and there's short, medium, long term. So we looked at short as 6 to 12 months, medium 1 to 2 years, and a long term is 2 to 5+ years. So that's really in the long term planning process. Secondly, relative cost was looked at. And then we identified lead and partner agencies. So the lead agency would be the one who would kind of be the responsible party and really driving the strategic action. And then partner agencies would be other neighboring agencies, so like railroad entities or ODOT. And then we looked at the prioritization, the relative prioritization. So there was a high, medium, low placed on each one of these strategic actions. So go to the next slide. So we have 3 strategic actions. We have 30 in our document. We just want to talk through 3 here today, just to kind of give a flavor of what is in that document. So we picked one from each of the timeframes. So there's a short term, a medium term, and a long term. So I'll talk about the short term permitting process improvement action, which is overlapping permits. So currently, the city has a policy of not allowing for submittal of concurrent permit applications, which may impact the same building area or overlap in permit scope. The reason behind this and the purpose behind this policy is to process applications in a straightforward manner and reduce any chance of conflict. The unintended consequence of this policy is that it can dramatically increase permit and construction timelines. And since there's been city restructuring and there's now the permitting is housed in a single agency PP&D, there may be an opportunity to allow for certain overlapping permitting. One concept is as a pilot project for industrial development, and then they could possibly expand it to other types of development, either citywide or kind of region by region. Currently, we do want to note that in some discretionary cases, the city does allow for overlapping permit review. In those cases, applicants are often informed during an early assistance meeting that they're eligible for overlapping review, but many times applicants don't seek early assistance meetings, so they're actually unaware of that option available to them. So some clarity in written documentation and city policy could help with that. The second strategic action is in the medium term, so the 1 to 2 year range, and it's e-zone mapping flexibility. So as part of the Columbia Corridor's industrial e-zone remapping project that we talked a bit about at the beginning and kind of touched on through this presentation, the application of environmental protection zones could potentially hinder site access and therefore future developability. So BPS has already identified a handful of sites where an application of a P zone could really complicate access considerations. And for those sites, BPS has converted P zone to C zone to allow for a more straightforward permitting process. This strategic action recommendation here looks to maintain BPS's flexibility in those conversions of P to C zones, just to enable future sites to develop if there's a difference in parcel configuration or a change in the E-zone mapping itself. And this is really to maintain flexibility and balance the environmental protection as well as maximize the existing constrained industrial land. The third and last recommendation we'll talk about here, the strategic action we'll talk about here today, is in the long term, and that's strategic infrastructure improvements. Now we've talked about infrastructure kind of throughout this presentation. It is a common trend when looking at these industrial sites, especially in the Columbia Corridor area. So as part of this project, McKinsey engineers developed a specific list of infrastructure and utility improvements that's based both on project experience and the infrastructure review that happened as part of that short-term inventory study and the site feasibility study. The strategic infrastructure improvements have a relative cost, really depending on the type of improvements that's required, where a signal on a levee is much more costly than a 200 feet of sewer line extension. Additionally, the partner agencies and lead agencies may vary based on the specific type of infrastructure improvement warranted. So I want to talk about these specific infrastructure improvements a little further if we can go to the next slide. So here's a few graphics that show the location of the improvements that are part of that strategic actions document. So as you'll see, kind of the ones in the orange circle are transportation improvements, and the ones in that purple or pink color there are utility improvements. So you can see that there's kind of these specific locations that we've listed as strategic infrastructure improvements. And the parcels that are shaded on the map are what we consider to be the benefited parcels. So those would be the parcels that may be directly impacted and benefited by the specific infrastructure improvement. Now, some of these are a bit hard to quantify. If signalization can have a very significant kind of near improvement impact, but it also extends out farther to other additional signals down the road or interchanges. So as Brian talked about earlier, when he's talking about the site feasibility analysis, we also did potential job creation calculations for just these specific strategic infrastructure improvements. As you can see here, there could be a potential for up to around 8,500 or 8,700 jobs that could be potentially created from these strategic infrastructure improvements. Now, I'll caveat this by saying these estimates are assumed to be less reliable than those from the site feasibility analysis, as no site layouts were performed, and because specific sites may have constraints that pose challenges to hinder development. So just because you build a signal, it doesn't mean a wetland on a site will go away. So these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt and just considered amongst other constraints. Go next slide. And I'll pause there to see if there's any questions on those strategic actions.
We should highlight, I think we were up to 26 total actions. So, you know, we're talking about 3 here. We have 26 across the board. Those will be included in the final report. But this is a sort of representative sample of what those might look like, or those do look like.
Not seeing any questions in the chat. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Okay, I think we have one from in the chat here. So regarding strategic actions, what are the factors considered to guide priority? Economic value, so dollars per acre, number of jobs, likelihood of implementation, ease of implementation, existing efforts underway. So it's kind of it's a multi-factor really analysis where what the relative priority would be. In the document that we'll include in the final report, we do note many of the city actions that are underway, or city actions that are underway that maybe this additional strategic action could be consolidated with because they're closely aligned, whether it be content-wise or it's an existing permitting effort. So that's one. Another one is kind of the immediacy of the impact. So this is something that we discussed extensively with the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, of what would have broad-reaching impacts and what could have a greater impact quicker, and what are kind of strategic improvements or strategic actions that are nice to have, but maybe might not impact the supply of industrial land, because that's really what we're looking to go after here. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. Maybe we can move to, I think Steve has a question.
Yeah, I'll raise my hand for this. I didn't read the report ahead of time. I should have, but as it goes, the analysis showed that I think 6 of the 15 sites were potentially developable, but at the margin, and those seem like the most strategic for additional actions. Did the analysis of the specific actions target that they would be especially useful for expanding development feasibility and expanding industrial land supply because they're addressing sites at the margin?
Yeah, so the strategic actions kind of looked for what is the largest amount of acreage that we could impact. Some of these sites were included kind of within that benefited sites area on the graphic that we showed, but we try to look at improvements that would have kind of the broadest reaching impacts as far as industrial acreage.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, go on.
Steve,
Sorry,
to
Brian.
add on to that, recall that the 15 sites that we studied were just meant to be representative. So the strategic actions, we're not trying to move the needle specifically on those 15 sites, but rather at a larger policy level. So the actions were developed on input from a few things. One was the short-term readiness and the site tiering. We learned some things from that. The next was the site feasibility. We learned more from that. And really a bunch of them came from just Mackenzie's involvement with the private development community. When we've got clients, saying, boy, this sure would be nice if we could do this thing. We tried to communicate that to the project partners and to the TAC and just get feedback. And there were some that our developer clients and friends would say would be really handy, but the TAC said, I don't think that's worth the effort. So, they didn't all make their way into the final matrix that you'll see.
And Francesca, Steve, others, the report, these won't be included in that link I sent out earlier. That link only includes the the 15 site studies. These actions will be integrated into the final report that's forthcoming. So Mackenzie's writing it as we speak. Well, hopefully not as we speak.
Yeah, before and after
speaking.
this meeting, yes, but not while we're doing it.
And I will share that. I'll share that link with this group as when that happens. But yeah, to that point, to follow on a little bit, there's this list has gone through multiple iterations. We met with PP&D, or I did with this list. We met with BES. Prosper's been heavily involved in this. Like we've been, with the recognition that most of these actions are, as Brian said, things the private development community would like to have. It doesn't necessarily mean that, we, the city, are suggesting them, right? Like it's a point, it's a starting point as we move through thinking about development ready industrial actions. We already have this starting point. Can we explore these further and think about their implementation? So okay, any other questions? We can wrap. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Just a quick comment. I was looking at one of the sites that you included in there, 4150 North Settle Road, and the report correctly says that there's a $0 cost per square foot of transportation improvements because the completed LID basically built them all. But what I was thinking about as I looked at that site is if we had been going through this exercise 10 years ago, that wound up being a $10 million local improvement district. And then you're kind of talking about the first mover. In other words, you have one person in a particular area that needs to develop, and then they're probably going to need to build off-site improvements, not just for street improvements, but things like sanitary sewer and stormwater. So not suggesting you do a lot of additional work. This is a great product, but it might be worth flagging on these 15 sites for which there's a cost of transportation improvements, whether all of those transportation improvements, and for that matter, sanitary sewer and other improvements, are those all specific to that site, or in the process of building the infrastructure, would there be adjoining properties that would benefit from the infrastructure? In other words, is part of the strategy here that you can spread those infrastructure costs among multiple potential sites, like one next door to the one you've identified, or is this all specific to the one site? On-site versus off-site, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so for the purposes of this analysis, we looked at it as if somebody wants to develop that site, they got to put in that pipe or do that improvement. And there likely will be other people, other properties along the way that would also benefit from that. So I think you're getting at, the appropriate financial mechanisms to fund construction of that pipe.
Yeah, and if the pipe to get to that particular property goes in front of a neighbor's property, did you basically, for purposes of this analysis, assume that the entire cost of extending the pipe was borne by the subject property that you're analyzing?
Correct. Yes.
I hear what you're saying. So
Yeah.
in the absence of being strategic and spreading those costs over multiple benefiting properties, it can kind of overstate the burden that would go on the one property if we didn't also try to, set the abutting properties up for development at the same time.
Right. Maybe Jerry can chime in here, but I would just think that if somebody's eager to develop, they're going to put the pipe in at their own cost and not wait for some kind of collaborative approach.
Yeah.
But again, if you go to Settle Road as an example, if you just had that one property at 4150 and they wanted to develop, well, that's $10 million for one property owner. But you do an LID and you have 20 property owners, and then now your average infrastructure tab has gone from 10 million down to 500,000. So huge difference in infrastructure costs, whether you do it as a comprehensive neighborhood-wide improvement or you try to do these one-off. And I think where this also ties in is, as long as I've been at the city, and I've been here a really long time, we've been talking about the holy grail of permitting reform. But to be fair to the people that work in PP&D, they got to make sure there's stormwater and, transportation infrastructure, sanitary sewer, et cetera. So we often talk about permitting reform when it really boils down to you've just got those infrastructure constraints that you just simply have to address. And the real question is, how do you do that cost effectively?
I think it's hard to match that up with the timeline as well, Andrew. For a lot of developers, they've got pressure. They need this thing started, and they don't have time to go through an LID process and uncertainty, and so they'll just look for another site.
But the flip side of that, and I'm kind of going to Brianna's comment in the chat, is they do take a stab at it and they go through our normal EA process, and then PP&D kind of have to look at everything as a frontage improvement thing. And so they may spend a year talking to PP&D. A better approach would be to have sort of a field general approach where we could tell somebody from the get-go, here's how you could develop the site. And to your point, if it takes too long or there's too much risk, fine, they don't have to pursue it. But at least they get the right answer up front, as opposed to spending a year trying to noodle around how to make everything fit into the on-site development paradigm, which, let's be real, most of these sites, they're undeveloped for a reason, and that's why you're looking at the necessity of doing the off-site improvement. So I think getting that information much earlier to potential developers who, as you say, make their own decision would be really helpful, because then we're offering them a solution that they're not going to get right away out of the EA process.
Yeah, it's a good suggestion. Thanks, Andrew. All right, we got some more comments here from Francesca in the chat regarding transportation projects. Yes, we do happen to have the signal at Marine Drive and 33rd on there for F. So you pegged that one right from the colors. And so, with many of these strategic actions, she said there's 25 or 30 of them, they may align with other ongoing actions that the city's taking right now. So great to hear that it's going into it's going to be prioritized in the Freight Master Plan. And ultimately, Sam will talk a little bit about how this is going to be used. So maybe instead of answering your last couple questions, we can just jump into those slides.
Yep. Take it away. Yeah. So, I mean, findings, just to add a little bit more meat to the bones here. We have, 320 acres of land that's ready for development now, basically based on Mackenzie's findings. Some of those tier 2 sites, I believe it was 6 months to a year, 2 years, could be developed ready with some targeted improvements, public improvements. But there are regulatory requirements like environmental zones and stormwater requirements that may reduce the buildable area of those industrial sites. They're held back financially, often due to site prep, building construction costs, as well as the remediation piece and the infrastructure piece. And if we really want to increase the supply of our developable acreage, we get more jobs, more investment, more equitable outcomes, greater tax base through some of those strategic actions, some of which require some significant funding. So caveats, next steps on the next page. I think we can rush through these quickly. Basically, the caveats are future development of these areas rely on a lot more than just public investment. But coordination is critical. Macroeconomic trends are going to play a factor. The city is constrained financially in the near term. That'll affect the ability and speed of public investments. But with all that being said, this project is it's not being accepted by or adopted by council in any way. This report will form or be adopted as an appendix to our economic opportunities analysis. I said earlier that we've had a lot of the work inform the EOA, inform the buildable land inventory, and you'll see some alignment there. But the idea is that this report lives on after Pillar, lives on after the adoption of the EOA. It forms sort of a good baseline, a good resource to refer back to. It is essentially it's essentially being developed as a private perspective, right? Private development, private investment perspective. So that's something that we can refer back to. Does that answer your question, Francesca, or does anybody else have any questions? I saw your hand was raised and went down.
Yeah, thanks. Can you remind me the timelines of the EOA now?
Sure, we're due to publish the proposed draft on December 9th. And then we will have Planning Commission hearing in January. Public testimony will open up shortly thereafter, and then City Council will take it up in the spring.
That's actually excellent timing for our TSP process, so that's something we can talk more about.
Yeah, please. Okay, and that was the entirety of the presentation. Looked like perfect timing. We had plenty of discussion, so thank you for that. Any other closing comments from anybody else? Does not look like it. Brian, you want to?
Good job, team.
This was really cool. It's very exciting. Thanks so much
good
for
conversation. Glad everyone was able to ask us questions that were on point, but didn't stump us too much. Thanks for that. Corky, you've always got some big thoughts. Do you want to say a little something before we wrap up?
That mean I talk too much?
No, you're a big picture guy. I love it.
Well, it's true. No, I think you summed it up really well. And just a thank you to everybody. This is, I think, really helpful. It's helpful for me. Don't take it, don't focus on it too much. I think, focus on the generalities a little bit more. But there's a lot of nice detail in there as well. So thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. As Sam mentioned, we're working on the final report, which should be published next month. And you got the teaser that Sam sent out the link for by email today, and he put in the chat here as well, which is those site profiles. And Andrew, appreciate your comments there on those as well. If any of the rest of you have comments, there's still time for revisions as we bundle up the final report. So
yeah, you've got my email, please. Yeah, please follow up with me. I'll pass things on. We're wrapping this up by the end of December, so we've still got Mackenzie on board until then.
And Steve, any last words? This was your baby.
You're muted,
you're
Steve.
muted.
I echo your comments, Corky. Thank you for all the effort, all of you behind making this work. I think it's very insightful, and there weren't too many surprises, but it's interesting connecting the dots and seeing how it fits together. The sites aren't that surprising, but they clarify for a lot of others that don't know much about the industrial land supply in Portland, I think. Hopefully this will be useful going ahead in the EOA process, and especially for Kate and Prosper Portland, and looking for sites for target industries.
Well said. Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody else. We'll give you 6 minutes back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.